It was supposed to be a perfect Saturday afternoon. The sun was shining, kids were laughing, and the smell of sizzling barbecue filled the air as the Johnson family enjoyed a cookout in their own backyard. But just as they were about to dig into their food, the mood shifted. A police car slowly pulled up in front of their house. Mrs. Johnson glanced at her husband, Captain Marcus Johnson, a high-ranking officer in the police force. "Did you call someone?" she asked, confused. He shook his head, already sensing what was happening. Moments later, an officer stepped out, looking almost as confused as the Johnsons. Turns out, their next-door neighbor, a woman who had always given them suspicious looks, had called 911. Her complaint: that there were suspicious people having a barbecue in the neighborhood. What she didn't know was that the very man she was trying to get in trouble was a respected police captain. As the officer approached, Marcus took a deep breath, deciding how to handle the situation. Would this be just another case of racial profiling, or was the neighbor about to face the reality of her own ignorance in the most unexpected way? The officer walked up the driveway, his eyes shifting between the neighbor peeking from behind her curtain and the family standing by the grill. He recognized Captain Johnson immediately, his posture stiffening with awkwardness. "Ah, Captain Johnson," the officer said hesitantly. Marcus gave a small nod, his face unreadable. "That's me. What's going on?" The officer cleared his throat, glancing at his notepad. "We got a call about suspicious activity. A barbecue." His voice trailed off, realizing how ridiculous it sounded. Mrs. Johnson crossed her arms. "Suspicious activity in our own backyard." Marcus exhaled slowly, his years on the force telling him exactly what had happened. The same neighbor, Mrs. Whitman, had always found a reason to complain. Too many cars in the driveway, music that wasn't even loud, their kids playing outside. But this was different. From the window, Mrs. Whitman watched, expecting things to unfold the way they always did when she made these calls. But this time, something was off. The officer wasn't accusing anyone. Instead, he looked embarrassed. And when Marcus took a step forward, his badge flashing in the sunlight, she suddenly realized this wasn't going the way she had planned. Marcus kept his composure, but inside, he felt the weight of the moment. He had spent years upholding the law, protecting his community, yet here he was, being treated like a suspect in his own home. He studied the officer's face, waiting to see how he would handle the situation. The officer shifted uncomfortably. "Look, Captain, I'm really sorry about this. I didn't know it was your house until I pulled up." Marcus glanced over at the neighbor's window, where Mrs. Whitman was still lurking. "That's the problem," he said, his voice calm but firm. "It shouldn't matter whose house this is." Mrs. Johnson stepped forward, her frustration evident. "She's been doing this for months. First, it was noise complaints when our kids played outside. Then she called the HOA about our porch decorations. And now this." The officer sighed. "Unfortunately, we have to respond to every call, but I can tell this isn't a real issue." Meanwhile, the Johnson kids stood frozen, their excitement from the barbecue replaced with confusion. Their youngest, Ethan, tugged at Marcus' sleeve. "Daddy, are we in trouble?" Marcus' heart clenched. He crouched down to his son's level. "No, buddy, we're not in trouble. But some people think we don't belong here." Across the street, a few neighbors had stepped outside, watching the scene unfold. Some whispered among themselves, while others simply looked uncomfortable. Mrs. Whitman, however, remained at her window, refusing to come outside. Then, just as Marcus was about to walk toward her door, another voice interrupted. "Hey, what's going on?" It was Mr. Garcia, a longtime neighbor who had always been friendly. "Why are the cops here?" The officer hesitated, not sure how to respond. But before he could answer, Mrs. Whitman's front door suddenly creaked open. She stepped out, her arms crossed, her expression tight. "I was just looking out for the neighborhood," she said, her voice sharp. "I didn't know who these people were." Marcus let her words hang in the air. She didn't know them. They had lived there for 5 years. Their kids went to the same school as her grandchildren. They had waved to her, greeted her, even invited her to a block party once. Mrs. Johnson let out a dry laugh. So after 5 years, you still don't know us? The tension in the air thickened. The officer glanced between them, waiting to see what would happen next. The small crowd of neighbors watched closely, and for the first time, Mrs. Whitman looked unsure of herself. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sounds were the distant hum of passing cars and the faint crackling of the grill behind them. Marcus studied Mrs. Whitman, watching as she shifted on her porch, her eyes darting between him and the gathering neighbors. She had expected this to go differently. Maybe she thought the cops would come, demand answers, and break up their barbecue. But now, with everyone watching, the weight of her actions was settling in. 5 years, Marcus finally said, his voice measured but firm. We've lived here 5 years, and you still don't know us. Mrs. Whitman lifted her chin. I was just being cautious. You can never be too sure these days. Mrs. Johnson let out a sharp breath, shaking her head. Cautious. If this was about safety, why haven't you called the cops on the Johnsons across the street when they have their big game nights? Or the Carters when their teenagers throw pool parties? Mrs. Whitman's mouth opened, but no words came out. The officer cleared his throat. Ma'am, were you aware that the man you reported is a police captain? Her face paled. I didn't know that. You didn't ask, Marcus said. You assumed. The neighbors murmured among themselves. Mr. Garcia crossed his arms, shaking his head. We all know Marcus and his family. They've never been a problem. Mrs. Whitman's grip on her doorframe tightened. I wasn't trying to cause trouble, she muttered. You already did, Mrs. Johnson shot back. Our kids saw a cop show up to their home because you thought their family looked suspicious. What do you think that teaches them? Marcus felt his son's small hand grip his own, and he looked down to see Ethan's wide, confused eyes. His heart clenched. The officer shifted uncomfortably. Captain, do you want to file a complaint? A heavy silence filled the air. Mrs. Whitman swallowed hard, her fingers still clinging to the door as if she was debating whether to step back inside or face what was coming. Marcus looked around, the neighbors, his wife, his kids, all waiting for what he would say next. This was it, the moment everything had built up to. He took a deep breath and turned back to Mrs. Whitman. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Mrs. Whitman blinked, caught off guard. The crowd leaned in, the tension at its breaking point. What happened next would change everything. Mrs. Whitman opened her mouth, then closed it, her fingers tightening on the doorframe. The weight of all the eyes on her seemed to press her into the ground. For the first time, she looked truly uncomfortable, but not in the way she had expected. This wasn't the quiet victory she had imagined when she made that call. Then, just as the tension reached its peak, another voice cut through the air. Wait, what's going on? Everyone turned. A teenage girl stood at the edge of Mrs. Whitman's porch, confusion written all over her face. It was her granddaughter, Lily. She had just arrived, her backpack slung over one shoulder, likely back from a friend's house. Lily, go inside, Mrs. Whitman said quickly, her voice sharp. But Lily didn't move. Instead, she looked past her grandmother and straight at Marcus. Captain Johnson. Her eyes widened as recognition set in. Wait, you work with my uncle, Officer Whitman. The air shifted instantly. A few people gasped. Marcus' eyebrows lifted slightly. Of all the things he expected, this wasn't one of them. Your uncle is Officer Whitman, he repeated, his voice careful. Lily nodded, stepping forward, ignoring her grandmother's warning glare. Yeah, he talks about you all the time. Says you're one of the best captains he's worked under. She looked around, realizing the tension in the air. Did something happen? Marcus didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned his gaze back to Mrs. Whitman, who looked like she wanted to disappear. The irony of the situation was thick in the air. She had called the cops on a man her own family deeply respected. The officer standing nearby shifted uncomfortably. "Captain, I actually know Officer Whitman too." "Shumes." Whitman's face drained of color. "That won't be necessary," she said quickly. But it was too late. The damage was done. The truth was out. And now her own granddaughter was looking at her like she was a stranger. Lily's expression hardened. "Grandma, why did you call the cops?" Mrs. Whitman's mouth opened, but for once she had no excuse. The truth stood there in front of her, unavoidable, undeniable, and for the first time she wasn't just being called out by her neighbors. She was being called out by her own blood. Mrs. Whitman stood frozen, her face pale. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Everyone was waiting for her to answer, but she had none. The reality of her actions had finally caught up to her, and now her own granddaughter was looking at her with disappointment. "Lily, it's not what you think," she finally muttered, her voice weak. Lily's eyes didn't waver. "Then what is it?" Marcus let out a slow breath, watching the moment unfold. He could see it now, the shift happening right in front of him. This wasn't just about a phone call anymore. It was about years of unspoken prejudice, the quiet stares, the subtle actions that built up over time. And now, for the first time, Mrs. Whitman had to face them. The officer beside Marcus exhaled. "Captain, I think it's clear there's no crime here." He turned to Mrs. Whitman, his voice firm but controlled. "Ma'am, I'm going to advise you not to misuse emergency services again. If there's no actual danger, these calls take time away from real emergencies." Mrs. Whitman swallowed hard and gave a small nod, her usual confidence stripped away. Marcus looked down at Ethan, who was still holding his hand. His son didn't fully understand what had happened, but he understood enough. And that was what hurt the most. Just as Marcus was about to turn back toward his family, Lily stepped forward. "I'm sorry, Captain Johnson. My uncle always talks about how fair you are. I don't know why my grandma did this." Mrs. Whitman flinched, but Lily didn't back down. Instead, she turned to her. "Grandma, you always say you care about this neighborhood, but what about the people in it?" A murmur rippled through the watching neighbors. Some nodded in agreement, others just watched, waiting to see what Mrs. Whitman would say. And then something unexpected happened. Mrs. Whitman's shoulders slumped, and she let out a shaky breath. For the first time she looked tired, like she wasn't just embarrassed, she was ashamed. I made a mistake," she said, barely above a whisper. It wasn't an excuse. It wasn't a justification. It was the closest thing to an apology Marcus had ever expected to get from her. Mrs. Johnson let out a small, disbelieving laugh. "You think?" A few neighbors chuckled nervously, breaking the tension just a little. Marcus met Mrs. Whitman's gaze, searching for any sign of sincerity. Maybe this was the start of something different. Maybe it wasn't. But for now, the moment had shifted. As the officer walked back to his car and the neighbors slowly started to disperse, Lily stayed on the porch, staring at her grandmother with an expression that said everything. And just before Marcus turned to go back inside, he caught Mrs. Whitman looking at him, not with anger, not with superiority, but with something else, something like regret. Marcus took a deep breath and glanced at his wife. She gave him a small nod, signaling it was time to move on. The barbecue that day, they weren't going to let this moment ruin it. He turned to Ethan and squeezed his hand. "Come on, buddy, let's eat." Ethan smiled, reassured by his father's calm presence, and ran back to the table where his siblings were waiting. Mrs. Johnson followed, but not before giving Mrs. Whitman one last look, a look that said, "You have a lot to think about, Lily stayed behind, watching her grandmother closely. "Grandma," she said softly, "we need to talk." Mrs. Whitman didn't argue. For the first time, she looked like she was ready to listen. Marcus walked back to the grill, flipping the burgers as if nothing had happened. But he knew something had changed. Maybe it wasn't a dramatic transformation, but it was a start. The Johnsons weren't going anywhere. This was their home, their neighborhood, their community, just as much as anyone else's. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, laughter filled the air again. The tension had passed, but the lesson would stay. And this time, maybe it wouldn't be forgotten.